relatives from the crew of an early 20th century shipwreck gather in Wollongong Harbour. They're about to embark on a voyage that will take them 15 nautical miles out to sea and over a century back in time to the wreck's position. Her name is Nemesis, where the entire crew of 32 perished exactly 120 years ago tonight. A Coast Guard vessel leads the first of the 4 boats out of the harbour. Despite the attempts of divers and historians to find the wreck, she remained undiscovered until a company contracted to find lost shipping containers accidentally came upon her remains. To each of the family members on board, there is no doubt that this is a time of reflection. The stories passed on by generations of family members, some true, others not, have led them all to be here today. After a 1-hour journey, a GPS mark leads the fleet to a position where 164 metres or 538 feet below is the wreck of the Nemesis. This is where it took place. The vessel's journey to this spot started in 1881 when she arrived from the UK after being purchased by the Huddart Parker Shipping Company. Initially as a collier, she was fitted out in 1883 at Mort's Dock, Sydney, offering second-class accommodation for the Sydney to Melbourne run, which proved very popular. Nemesis was involved in a number of incidents during her life, but the one that took place in Sydney Harbour could only be described as a tragic freak accident. On March 3, 1885, a contingent of New South Wales troops were to leave Sydney on the troop ships Australasian and Iberia to fight in the Sudan. Thousands packed the shoreline of the harbour to bid farewell. Upon departure of these ships, scores of vessels, both large and small, followed the troop ships towards the heads. One of them was the Nemesis. On board the Nemesis was Maria Cecil and good friends Francis and Margaret Capel. The group had joined the Nemesis to say goodbye to Maria Cecil's husband, who was one of the volunteer troopers on the Iberia. Adjacent to the Hornby Lighthouse at the South Head, the Iberia and the Nemesis collided. Maria Cecil was killed instantly, and Margaret Capel died in hospital that night. Although Trooper Cecil was aware of the collision, he had no idea that his wife and their good friend Margaret Capel had been fatally injured. He found out when the Iberia docked in Port Adelaide and soon returned to Sydney. In August 1890, Nemesis made her first 2,000 nautical miles voyage to Western Australia. Carrying gold seekers past the gale-prone waters of the Great Australian Bight, she was guided by lighthouses like Green Cape in New South Wales and Cape Nelson in Victoria. Gradually replaced on the passenger service by more modern vessels, she was regulated back to collier status in the last years of the century. In early July 1904, Nemesis arrived in Newcastle for another shipment of coal. Prior to the building of the North and South Break Wall, which took almost a century, the port of Newcastle was regarded by many as the most dangerous in the Commonwealth. Along her entrance lay half a dozen large wrecks that had been grounded on a sandbar known to the locals as the Oyster Bank. In more recent times, the stranding of the Pasha Bulka in June 2007 brought thousands to the area to witness the spectacle, adding another chapter to the already rich maritime history of Newcastle. Bound for Melbourne, Nemesis steamed past Nobby's Headland at 1 p.m. on July 8th, close to the wrecks of two other Huddard Parker steamers, the Wenduri and the Lindis. Both had been purchased around the same time as the Nemesis and were victims of the dreaded Oyster Bank. Nemesis was the sole survivor of the trio. But that was about to change. Nemesis slowly made her way south into an increasing force. Late that night, she passed Botany Bay, ploughing head on to a massive storm that would be forever known as the Nemesis Gale. Like this recent footage shot over 100 years later, Saturday, July 9th, 1904, found Sydney Harbour shipping departures in turmoil. Several vessels attempted to leave port in accordance with their timetables but were forced back. Their commanders decided it was far too dangerous to continue. One vessel that did leave Sydney was the steamer Marloo. She had departed just after midnight, bound for Melbourne. At 2:45 p.m. on that afternoon, a vessel was sighted by the Marloo 10 miles out to sea, adjacent to Coal Cliff. It was the Nemesis. Captain Davies of the Marloo estimated her speed to be no more than 1 knot. Nemesis would continue from her last sighting for approximately another 15 nautical miles to the position where she was overwhelmed by the elements. The vessel foundered, spilling her crew into the cold water with no hope of survival. Aided by winds and current, wreckage was forced closer to shore towards the coastline of the Royal National Park. Within days, small pieces of wreckage were found in Guatemala, but the majority was forced into Bait Bay, with pieces of the ship scattered along the length of Cronulla beaches. The wreckage included 25 cork lifebelts, cabin fittings, pillows, hatch covers, and the remains of 3 smashed lifeboats. Also found were a number of flares to which some had been spent. A large box with parcels, SS Nemesis, was found in Boat Harbour, a small inlet at the very northern tip of the beach. This prompted maritime experts to believe the ship had turned around seeking shelter in Botany Bay, only to founder of port hacking. Some suggested she had struck the Gibbon Bombora near the entrance to the port. This theory was further enhanced when 4 bodies washed ashore in the same area over a 1-month period. Those 4 bodies were interred in 2 unmarked graves in the Warrenora Cemetery in Sutherland. The first body that came ashore was initially laid to rest unidentified, despite the description of a tattoo on his forearm of a woman in the sitting position holding a flag above her head. However, his wife later identified him as William Cole. Third Officer Joe Linklater was identified by a letter addressed to him found in his clothing. A third body was also placed in this grave, which was either lamp trimmer N. McLeod or an unknown seaman. Records are unclear. It is believed that the bodies were laid on top of each other, which was customary in those days, not side by side. News of the wreckage ashore brought Sydney relatives of the crew to Cronulla Beach. Many stayed over consecutive nights, hoping for news of their loved ones. This draw latch was retrieved by the Russell family and made into a memorial for 30-year-old fireman Alf Russell.
Fireman Alfred Russell from Sydney, 30. With Captain Alexander Lusher from England, he was 48. Third engineer, Richard Woodhouse from England, aged 43. Stewardess, Mrs. M. Highland from Canada, aged 56. Ship's boy, Aubrey Corrigan from Sydney, aged 18.
As the ship disappeared beneath the waves, two of her senior crew must have been in disbelief of their situation. Chief Officer Renault and Engineer Morrison, 2 years earlier, had survived the sinking of the steamer Allingamite, another Huddard Parker vessel off the New Zealand coast. 45 were lost in that disaster. Their faces remain unidentified in this group picture of survivors from that wreck. The finding of the Nemesis closes a page in the maritime history of New South Wales. She was regarded by Sydney wreck divers as the holy grail of New South Wales shipwrecks. Over the years, many dives and searches were carried out by a score of individuals from Port Hacking down to Kiama on the south coast, all to no avail. The Nemesis was just one of 8,000 wrecks around the vast coastline of Australia. They range from a few metres below the surface to depths where no free swimming diver could ever achieve. Each one a time capsule in the moment in time, each one with a story. Where passengers once strolled, sea creatures now live. The makers of these vessels could never have imagined this. Most of that 8,000 still remain to be discovered.